My name is Nora Calloway. I was 30 when everything changed. I used to think the worst part of my day was the 11-hour shift at Maggie's Diner, the ache that lived permanently in the arches of my feet, the way the grease smell clung to my hair no matter how many times I washed it. I was wrong. The worst part of my day was always 5 o'clock, when my sister Diane walked in with her sunglasses pushed up into her blowout, ordered a black coffee she never finished, and reminded me, gently, the way people remind you of something they enjoy reminding you of, that I had once been the smart one. You had the scholarship offer, she'd say, stirring a coffee she wouldn't drink. And now look at you. I would look down at my apron, at the pen stains on the pocket, at my name tag that said Nora in blue block letters, and I would smile the smile I had perfected over 6 years of smiling at people who didn't deserve it. My daughter Ivy was 5. She didn't know that her mother used to dream of running a lab, that there had been a summer, 8 years ago, when I sat at my father's kitchen table and helped him sketch the early plans for a water filtration cartridge that never got funding because he died before the prototype was finished. She didn't know that I had signed away my share of his workshop equipment at 22, grieving and exhausted, because my mother told me it was the adult thing to do, and Diane's husband had the connections to actually make something of it.
She didn't know any of that.
She just knew that some nights I came home smelling like fryer oil, and she would put her small hand on my cheek and say, "You smell like pancakes, Mommy," like it was the nicest thing in the world.
Some nights it was.
The diner sat 2 blocks from the harbor, close enough that on clear mornings the light came in gold and low, and made even the cracked vinyl booths look like something out of an old photograph. It was in that gold light, on a Tuesday I didn't know would matter, that I first noticed the man in the corner booth. He came in alone. He ordered black coffee and rye toast, nothing else, and he read the newspaper the old-fashioned way, folded into quarters, like he wasn't in any hurry to be somewhere more important. He tipped well. He never said much. I didn't think about him at all, except to notice the way you notice weather, that he was there and then he wasn't and then he was there again. I had no idea, that Tuesday, that he had already heard my sister call me pathetic in front of the whole restaurant. I had no idea he'd been listening for weeks. I only knew that Ivy needed new shoes, that my mother had stopped returning my calls unless she needed something, and that I had exactly $41 until Friday. That was the whole of my world. It felt, at the time, like it would always be that small. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after grief has settled into furniture. My father's workshop had that quiet. Nobody had touched it since he died. Not really. My mother kept it for sentimental reasons, which meant she kept it because clearing it out would have required admitting he was gone in a way that paying the electric bill on an empty building somehow didn't. I went there sometimes, after closing at the diner, when Ivy was asleep at my mother's, and I told myself I was only stopping by. I liked the smell of sawdust that never quite left the walls. I liked sitting in his old chair and pretending, for 10 minutes, that I was still the girl who used to hand him wrenches and ask him what everything did. It was on one of those nights that I found the shoebox. It was tucked behind a stack of old blueprints, unlabeled, the cardboard soft with age. Inside were letters, dozens of them, between my father and a man named Julian Voss. I didn't recognize the name at first. The letters spanned almost 2 years, and they weren't business correspondence in the cold sense. They were 2 men talking through an idea, testing it, arguing gently about filtration membranes and manufacturing costs, and somewhere in the 3rd or 4th letter, my father had written, "Nora helped me redraft the flow diagram last week. She caught an error I'd missed twice. I think she has better instincts for this than I do." I sat on the workshop floor and read that sentence 4 times. There was a final letter, dated 2 months before he died, in which my father proposed a formal partnership, equal ownership, split between himself and this Julian Voss, with a clause reserving a portion of any future proceeds for NC, in recognition of her contribution to the original design. It wasn't signed. I didn't know if it had ever been sent. I didn't know, sitting there in the sawdust quiet, that Julian Voss had a first name.
Julian.
I didn't know that Julian Voss had, in fact, signed that letter, mailed his half back, and never received a response, because my father died 3 weeks later, and no one in my family had known the agreement existed, let alone honored it. I didn't know that the quiet man in the corner booth, the one who tipped well and read his newspaper folded into quarters, had spent 30 years turning a filtration patent, built on a design my father and I had drawn together at a kitchen table, into a company worth more than I could imagine. I only knew that my hands were shaking, and that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if it was grief or something closer to hope. My mother's 60th birthday dinner was held at Diane's house, in the kitchen she liked to call the heart of the home, in a voice that suggested she'd read the phrase on a decorative sign somewhere. I brought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford and Ivy's hand-drawn card, and I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, the way you do when you already know a room isn't going to be kind to you. Diane's husband, Rob, had inherited what remained of my father's tools and equipment years ago. Inherited being a generous word for a transfer I had signed under duress and grief. He'd since sold most of it for scrap, unable to make sense of drawings he didn't understand, and turned the workshop into a home gym. Nobody in my family seemed to think this was a loss worth mentioning. "There she is," Diane said, not looking up from the roast. "Still at the diner?" "Still at the diner," I said. "You know," my mother added, arranging deviled eggs with the precision of a woman defusing a bomb, "your father would be disappointed you never did anything with that brain of yours." I felt the old shame rise, familiar as a coat I'd worn too many winters. And then, quietly underneath it, I felt something else. The shoebox. The unsigned letter. NC, in recognition of her contribution. "He drew the original filtration diagram with me," I said. "At the kitchen table. I was 22. Diane laughed, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "Nora, sweetheart, you handed him a pencil. Don't rewrite history, because you're bitter." I didn't argue. I had learned, over 6 years of quiet humiliations, that arguing only fed the room's appetite. I ate my dinner. I complimented the roast. I let Ivy show everyone her card, and I watched my mother accept it with the distracted warmth she reserved for things that weren't really about her. But that night, driving home with Ivy asleep in her car seat, I thought about Julian Voss in his corner booth, and the newspaper folded into quarters, and the black coffee he never rushed. I thought about the sentence my father had written about me 30 years ago, preserved in a shoebox nobody else had bothered to open. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I'd found. I only knew that something in me, some small unlit room, had quietly turned its light on. He was there the next morning as he almost always was. I brought his coffee without being asked, the way I did every Tuesday, and for the first time, I let myself really look at him, the neat gray suit that didn't quite match a diner, the watch that was plain in a way expensive things sometimes are, the newspaper he still read the old-fashioned way. "You've been coming here a long time," I said. It wasn't really a question. "Almost 2 years," he said, folding his paper closed. "The coffee's terrible. I keep coming back anyway." I laughed before I could stop myself. It surprised me, the sound of it. I hadn't laughed easily in a while. "Can I ask you something strange?" I said. My heart was doing something complicated in my chest. "Did you know a man named Elliot Calloway?" The newspaper stayed folded. Something in his face went very still, the way water goes still right before it's disturbed. "Elliot Calloway," he repeated, like he was testing whether the name still fit in his mouth after all these years.
Yes.
I knew him. He was my father. For a long moment, Julian Voss didn't say anything at all. He looked at me, really looked the way you look at a photograph you haven't seen in a long time and are trying to place, and something behind his eyes seemed to rearrange itself. "You caught the error in the flow diagram," he said finally, quietly. "The membrane calibration."
He wrote to me about it.
He was so proud, he could barely finish the sentence. I had to put my hand on the edge of the table. "I found the letters," I said. 2 nights ago. In his workshop. There was an unsigned partnership agreement. He never sent it. He died before. "He sent it," Julian said. "I signed it. I mailed it back within the week." He paused, and something moved through his expression that looked almost like grief, decades old and carefully stored. "I never heard from anyone in his family. I assumed you didn't want anything to do with the company. I assumed, wrongly, that meant no one wanted anything to do with me either." I sat down across from him without asking, without thinking about the other tables, without thinking about anything except the sound of my own pulse. Nobody knew, I said. Nobody knew any of it. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup a slow half-circle on its saucer. When he finally spoke, his voice had the careful weight of a man choosing words he intended to keep. Then I think, he said, we have 30 years of paperwork to correct. It took 3 weeks, a patent attorney named Sophia Reyes, and more late nights than I could count around my kitchen table. Ivy asleep upstairs, documents spread across the same worn wood where I had once helped my father draw filtration lines by hand, to understand the shape of what had actually happened. My father and Julian had formed a verbal and then written partnership. The design my father and I sketched together became the foundation of a filtration membrane that, refined over 3 decades by Julian's engineering team, was now licensed in water treatment systems across 4 continents. My father's estate had never formally claimed its share, not from Julian's silence, but from my family's, because no one had ever told anyone the partnership existed. Rob had scrapped the physical prototypes for a few $100s, unaware he was discarding the origin of something now worth considerably more. You have a legitimate claim, Sophia told me, sliding a folder across the table. A strong one. Contemporaneous letters, an original signed agreement, testimony from Mr. Voss himself. This isn't charity, Nora. This is yours. I thought about Diane's laugh at the birthday dinner. Don't rewrite history because you're bitter, and I felt something settle in me that wasn't quite anger. It was steadier than anger. It felt like the floor finally holding weight it had always been meant to hold. I didn't tell my family right away. I let the paperwork move quietly, the way real justice usually does. Not with a slammed door, but with a signature, a notary stamp, a wire transfer that took 4 business days to clear. Julian insisted on backdating my father's original share to reflect 3 decades of licensing revenue, an amount so large I had to read the number twice before I understood it wasn't a mistake. Your father believed in this, Julian said, when I tried, badly, to thank him. I only kept his half safe. The other half was always going to find its way to you eventually. I'm only sorry it took this long. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt, more than anything, like a door I hadn't known was locked had quietly swung open, and behind it was a version of my life I had stopped letting myself imagine. I bought Ivy new shoes that week. I didn't need to check the bank balance first. It was such a small thing, and it undid me completely. I invited my mother and Diane to dinner myself. This time, at my apartment, small as it was. I made the pot roast my father used to make, the recipe I'd kept in a card box since he died. I set the table with the good plates I'd bought secondhand and saved for years. What's the occasion? Diane asked, looking around my apartment with a faint, practiced disappointment she brought to most rooms that weren't hers. I found something of Dad's, I said. I thought you should know about it before anyone else does. I laid the folder on the table between us. The letters, the signed agreement, Sophia's summary of the settlement. I watched my mother's face as she read, watched the color leave it in slow degrees, the way weather changes before you notice the sky. This can't be right, Diane said, flipping pages too fast to actually be reading them. Dad never mentioned a partner. He never mentioned you being involved in any of this. He mentioned it to Julian Voss, I said. In writing. Repeatedly.
He was proud of it.
He just never got the chance to tell either of you because he died 3 weeks after signing it, and none of us thought to look in a shoebox in a workshop you turned into a gym. I said it without heat. I had promised myself, all those weeks, that when this moment came, I would not need to raise my voice to be heard. My mother put the folder down slowly. Mock me again, I dare you. I said quietly, not a threat, not really, but the closest thing to one I had ever allowed myself. Tell me one more time that I never did anything with my brain. I'd like to hear it now. Nobody said anything for a long time. Diane looked at the table. My mother looked at the folder, and then at me, and something in her face, not quite an apology, but the shape one might eventually grow from, moved across it like a slow tide. I didn't know, she said finally. It wasn't enough. It was, for the first time in years, something. Julian came to the diner one last Tuesday before the company's board meeting, where the corrected ownership records would be formally entered, my name alongside my father's on a filing that had waited 30 years to be complete. He ordered the same black coffee, the same rye toast, and I sat across from him during my break, the way I had a dozen times since that first startled conversation. "You could quit, he said. "The diner. You don't have to be here anymore." "I know," I said. And I did know. The number in my account had made that abundantly, almost absurdly clear. "I think I'll finish out the season, though. There's a woman here, Rosa, training for her GED at night. I promised I'd cover her shifts so she could study. Feels wrong to leave her short." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression, pride, maybe, or recognition of a quality he'd seen once in my father and hadn't expected to find again so precisely, settled into something like quiet approval. "Your father used to say something similar," he said, "that the measure of a design wasn't how clever it was. It was whether it held up under weight it wasn't built to expect." I thought of Diane's kitchen, the deviled eggs, the 60 birthday candles, the years of small humiliations I had swallowed because I hadn't known, yet, that I was allowed to stop. I thought of the shoebox, the sawdust, the sentence my father wrote about me before I even knew I would need it. "I held up," I said. "You did," he said. "Better than most people ever have to." He didn't say anything else for a while. We sat in that comfortable silence he'd carried into the diner for 2 years before I ever knew his name, and for the first time, I understood that his silence had never been indifference. It had been patience, the same patience my father used to talk about, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply waits for the right moment to matter. Ivy is 6 now. She still tells me I smell like pancakes on the nights I fill in at the diner, and I still let her because some things are worth keeping even after they stop being necessary. The workshop is mine again, legally, formally, on paper this time. I had the home gym equipment removed and the old workbench restored, and some evenings, after Ivy is asleep, I sit in my father's chair with a set of blueprints spread in front of me, sketching filtration ideas of my own now, ones with my name on the corner of the page instead of tucked into a shoebox as a footnote to someone else's. Diane and I don't talk often. There is no dramatic reconciliation to report, no tearful embrace at a doorway, only a slow, careful thaw, the kind that happens between people who are still deciding whether the relationship is worth rebuilding at all. My mother calls more now. I let her. I don't know yet if that's forgiveness or simply fatigue, and I've stopped needing to name it either way. What I know is this. There is a particular gold light that comes through the diner windows at 5 o'clock, the same light that used to announce Diane's arrival and the small daily cruelty I'd trained myself to absorb. It still comes through the windows now. But I notice, these days, that it falls differently, not like a spotlight on my humiliation, but like something ordinary and warm, the kind of light that simply exists whether or not anyone is being unkind beneath it. I think about my father sometimes at that hour. I think about a kitchen table and a pencil and a 19-year-old boy, no, a 19-year-old girl, myself, correcting an error he'd missed twice, not knowing that sentence would outlive him, would outlast a decade of doubt, would eventually come home to me in the quiet, patient silence of a man who never once raised his voice to prove he was right. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be found. I found mine in a shoebox, in the sawdust quiet of a room nobody else thought to enter. And when I finally set it down on the table in front of the people who had spent years making me small, I didn't need anger to make my point. I only needed to be believed. And, finally, quietly, I was